Hello and welcome. This is Clint Berry with Superior Livestock Auction, and I'm joined today by Davey Jones with Ag Defense Risk Management, talking a little bit about how to utilize livestock gross margin in our risk management strategies. If this is the second video in the series, if you didn't get a chance, we'd encourage you to go back and look at video number 1. We delved a little bit into the history of LGM and into the mechanics of how it works, and then in the follow-up series on this video, we're going to talk a little bit about how to utilize livestock gross margin as your primary risk management tool. Davey, can you tell us a little bit more about how that might fit for producers in that scenario?
Sure, we'll do our best anyway. Obviously, even when you're using something as a primary risk strategy, that does not necessarily mean it's the only risk management strategy.
Good point.
So there's places where livestock gross margin may well fit as the primary risk strategy. As a matter of fact, as we talked about in the previous video, when RMA developed this program, the intent was it was a program that could be used in lieu of the crush, that it was made to be the risk management strategy. So obviously there are places where it would fit in that respect, and as we try to look through this and realistically analyze where it fits and where it doesn't fit and when it fits, when it does fit, we ask some basic questions, and paramount in those questions is, what are the desires of the producer or the cattle feeder? What are his goals or her goals? What are they trying to accomplish, rather than to try to start with the product and make it fit the customer? You make what the customer wants fit the product to that. And so in that line of thought, I think some of the areas where it fits well as the primary risk strategy is when there's a desire on the part of the cattle feeder to avoid margin calls and hedging accounts.
That's a big one right there.
It can be a big one. In a perfect world, and everyone understands hedging perfectly, including lenders. Money's made available to fund those margin accounts, and not a lot of anxiety involved in it. But in the real world, in some cases, the margins calls and the margin accounts are a huge source of not only financial stress but mental stress. Yes. And some people just choose to get away from them. Unfortunately, some of the routes that they might pick to get away from margin calls may create some other problems. And so we think LGM has a place where it fits in well when that's one of the primary goals of the cattle feeder, is to avoid those. Another place where it fits well, and we haven't really addressed this at all yet, but it kind of comes inherent to the nature of the program. If you remember that what it does is it mirrors futures positions, but it does not take futures positions. So LGM has the potential to open up the top side, but only if there are not futures contracts in place. So much like where you would take a put option if you wanted downside protection on a commodity, but you wanted the upside potential left intact, LGM does have downside protection similar to a crush position using futures contracts. But there are no futures contracts. So if those gross margins increase, and assuming that LGM is an accurate mirror of what the crush margins are protecting, then in those increased gross margin environments, you would reap the benefit of those. So you'd have downside protection, but you'd have open upside potential. And so when that is a producer's primary goal, is to open up the upside potential and maintain the coverage on the downside risk, then LGM can find a place in that scenario as well. And the downside protection that is there would be very similar to any other kind of downside protection. So it's actually a very this is kind of the point where the discussions get really pretty interesting, is that you can do a lot of things with LGM. And you can also supplement that. So for example, in that scenario, let's say your goal was to leave the top side open, and let's say markets turned in your favor, and now you've got a margin that you are satisfied with. Well, then you could still go ahead and put your futures contracts in place then, but you had downside protection waiting on that to occur. So it creates a lot of flexibility when the upside potential is of a lot of interest to a feeder, or where avoiding the margin calls and margin accounts is a big priority.
Just another example of how livestock gross margin protection can be tailored to each producer and gives them a lot of flexible options out there. While there are some concrete parts of it, it has the flexibility to operate differently to match up what your program's needs are.
Correct. Now, on the flip side of that, that's some areas where it fits. Well, I think you can also rule out some areas and say, where does it not fit? Well, when the timing of the calculations that we talked about in the previous video, that 2-month back and that 5-month back on a yearling fed for the feeder and the 2-month back on the corn and the end of the month. I mean, what if you sell your cattle early in December, but it's not settling the price until late in December? So when the timing of the calculations don't really look like they mesh well with where you see your risk at, then it really isn't a good fit as a primary or the premier risk management strategy, because timing is key in managing risk. And so, those things, you can't discount the importance of analyzing even those things. So while we're sitting here on one hand saying there's places where it fits, then there are also some reasons why it might not fit. The other thing, if you want to follow seasonal trends, but you don't have timely protection when you're actually selling the cattle, then LGM would not be a great fit as the primary strategy. If you want to follow seasonal trends, that would tend to lend itself more to what we'll talk about in the next video, using it as a secondary strategy. So those two would be good to point out. And then something that is always critical, no matter what kind of business you're in, unless you just won the lottery and you're running a small mom and pop shop, is what does your lender think about the program? You wouldn't want to use this without your lender's approval. Because you don't want to, and we wouldn't want to interrupt your borrowing arrangements with your bank. I think most lenders would be more than happy to tune into this well enough to understand it. Right. But you would not want to just jump out and do this and stop doing what you always have been doing, unless your lender was aware that was a move you were making and given their consent, or at least not opposed to it.
Sure. Just open dialogue and communication. And another good point, while a producer, there's a lot of scenarios and a lot of options and a lot of detailed information onto the program, but why it's so important to reach out and talk to a trusted agent like yourself and your team so that they can understand how that best fits with them, and then have that conversation with their lender or have that conversation with the other members in their family, because in agriculture it's almost always not just a one-person operation.
Right, that's exactly right. Communication's always key, and kind of our philosophy at Ag Defense has always been, we feel like I guess this wouldn't be 100% of the people out there, but we feel like the vast majority of people are really smart. Yep. And they'll make the right decision if they have the right information. So our goal is to share the right information with our producers and anyone else they would ask us to share it with. So if you're a producer and you like this concept and you understand, hey, my broker needs to kind of understand how this is working too, because we're going to have to do some things together sometimes, and my lender needs to understand. I don't know if I'm going to go talk to the spouse or not, but I guess we'd do that if requested. But that communication is key in this as well as anything else that we do. We've mentioned crush a few times, and when we're talking about the crush margin, or when we're talking about a crush, that's just a term that is used for the relationship between the futures contracts that are normally purchased by cattle feeders in order to protect their interest in the feed yard. A crush margin might be exactly like LGM has got it. 750-pound steers 5 months back, 50 bushels of corn 2 months back, and a 1,250-pound steer in the month that it's marketed. But your crush margin may say, well, it's a 1,400-pound steer and an 850-pound feeder and 60 bushel of corn. The way people would put volumes into a crush position would vary, but the futures contracts that are used to protect feeding margins is historically been called the crush.
So continuing on with how to utilize LGM as your primary risk management tool, let's talk a little bit about the advantages and the disadvantages that come with that coverage.
Okay, yeah, I think we could just kind of address this in bullet point form. On the advantages side, when looking at it as a primary risk strategy, you don't have margin calls. Now, whether that's a big deal or not to anyone is it depends on that person's outlook, but there's not many people would say that if I could get away from margin calls, it would be a nice thing. So that's one of the advantages, and that you also don't have to maintain the brokerage account in order to have an LGM. That provides downside gross margin protection. It does that as well as anything, and it preserves the upside margin potential when used as the primary risk strategy, which would mean in that scenario you might have some other options contracts out there, you might have some other method you're employing to manage risk, but what you haven't done if you're maintaining the upside is you haven't taken futures positions that lock you out of the upside. So it gives the potential of the upside margin. And then it historically covers its own cost because of the subsidies. You look at any scenario, any arrangement of coverage that we would go down with any individual producer. If you say, okay, here's how this producer set up the coverage and here's how this producer set their coverage up, and you do a 5-year backcast on that, because of the subsidies, those programs have probably paid their own way to exist. And that is a really unique feature of all types of crop insurance, livestock gross margin included. So I would say those would be the primary advantages. When looking at it specifically as a primary risk strategy, the disadvantages then would kind of look at the other side of that coin. It's not available on a pen-specific basis. A lot of people are used to doing things by the pen. Well, it's a monthly basis, not a pen basis. So you have to kind of adjust your thinking, and change is always a little difficult for most people, and so that would be a disadvantage. The timing of the gross margin calculations, as we've already mentioned, they can be problematic. For if you sell cattle late in the month and your loss is settled, or you sell cattle early in the month and your loss is settled late in the month, there are times when that can be problematic. Obviously, there could be times that would be advantageous too. And so in the long run, it may work out fine. But if it's the only risk strategy you've got employed and you hit that month where it's a disadvantage, that can create cash flow issues. And so that's why in looking at it as your primary risk strategy, the timing becomes a little more of a deterrent than it would if it was not the primary risk strategy that you were using. That had better timing elements to it. And then LGM is most effective as primary risk strategy on a non-pooled basis. So we've already talked about how premiums can be impacted by whether you pool or don't pool. Well, to get the timing as precise as possible, you would want it on a non-pooled basis, which means the cost is a little higher. So it's not as cost effective as LGM is on a pooled basis, but as a primary risk strategy, it's almost got to be on a non-pooled or a very slightly pooled basis. So in weighing the advantages and disadvantages along with where it fits and where it doesn't fit, I think that you can see there's the need for a more specific conversation about each individual person's operation to know how to apply those. But I think it's good to know that all of those things do come into play. They come into the conversation, and they help us determine if this really is a scenario where it fits well as the primary risk strategy, or if we need to turn our attention, as we will in these videos, to using it as a secondary risk strategy. And so in determining whether it's a primary risk strategy, I think this pretty much covers the main topics that would go into an individual discussion.
All really good points, and it's nice to throw them out there to allow our producer to try to absorb that and to reach out and talk to you and your team and see how those features fit into each one of their programs to tailor match into what their goals are for each of their own operations.
Right.
Well, thank you for your time today, and we encourage you to reach out to Davy Jones and his team at Ag Defense Risk Management. Contact information is on the screen there. If you didn't get a chance, go back and take a look at the first video as we talked about the history and the mechanics of what livestock gross margin is, and tune in for the third video as we continue to delve a little deeper into how this protection works for your operation.